A champion is bred from hard times, scarred mind standing on the ledge. The squad grind all time, victory in spite of opposition. Welcome to competition. You pick a side, I pick a side, they pick a side. Take a knee against abuse, they rather you die. Pushing through dark tunnels, trying to shed light. The fight is on the moment we enter the game of life. Get it right before the whole thing gone dead. Let's go ahead and take it there. Meet me on the edge.
Welcome to Edge of Sports, brought to you by the Real News Network. I'm Dave Zirin. We are going to talk to a journalist and New York Times bestselling author right now. Her name is Abraham Josephine Riesman, and we're going to talk about her book, Ringmaster, Vince McMahon and the Unmaking of America. Abraham Josephine Riesman, thank you so much for joining us here on Edge of Sports.
Thanks for having me.
Okay, look, the charges against Vince McMahon are so nauseating. I mean, rape, sex trafficking, acts of non-consensual degradation. As someone who has studied this man, did any of this surprise even you?
Let me put it this way. When I first read the lawsuit brought by former WWE employee Janel Grant against Vince McMahon, I was shocked but not surprised. I was shocked at the details because these allegations do seem to describe things that go farther than what we've known, or at least had allegations about Vince doing in the past. But it was really a matter of degree rather than distinction between the past allegations and these new ones. It was a matter of those past alleged acts turned up to 11 in many ways, because Vince has a long history of degrading people, and much of that is not an allegation at all. You can just watch his television program, especially old episodes from around the turn of the last millennium, and you'll see examples of, female wrestlers being forced to get on all fours, strip to their bra and panties, and bark like dogs. That's the kind of thing that Vince McMahon was not just putting on television, but, having his workers do. So seeing these allegations was shocking insofar as the details cannot help but shock a person, but not surprising necessarily when you look at the pattern of other allegations in the past.
You see, you've got these two persona, and I want you to try to explain to us or tease out where they're the same, where they're different, or does it even matter at this point? I mean, you've got Vince McMahon, the billionaire impresario of World Wrestling Entertainment, who's been in charge for 4 decades, running this organization to greater or lesser extents during those 4 decades. And then you have his on-screen character, one wrestling journalist called maybe the greatest, most important character in the history of professional wrestling. And that character is, of course, the boss, the ultimate a-hole, the guy who harasses women, who in one plot point sex trafficked his own daughter. Now, at this point, do you see any differences between the person and the character? Does it even matter from what you know of this person's history? Is this one of those cases of him forgetting who the real person was, or is this the real person?
The contention I make in my book, Ringmaster, is that the second persona you're describing, the character copyrighted as Mr. McMahon, is, yes, in some ways based on Vince, but in many ways, I see him, that character that is, as a gross exaggeration of Vince's father. Now, Vince's father, not necessarily known for the sexual stuff, but he was known within wrestling as a guy you didn't want to cross. And more importantly, his father was a Northeastern rich kid, as opposed to Vince, who lived this very bifurcated existence. He didn't know his birth father until he was 12, and he was raised in poverty in the South. So part of the image of the Mr. McMahon character is that he was kind of born with a silver spoon in his mouth, or that he's always been this patrician Northeasterner. But I think it's important to note those divergence points where Vince has a very different background than you might expect for a Mr. McMahon. But when it comes to, I guess, the allegations and the televised reality of depravity, there's a lot of overlap there. I mean, if we take even a fraction of Janel Grant's allegations to be true, it means that Vince McMahon was much closer to the character he was playing when he was degrading women on television than many people thought or gave credit to.
Yeah, I view Vince McMahon, the person behind the camera, as a Paleolithic right-wing bigot, someone who's never hesitated to use racism, sexism, homophobia, transphobia for entertainment purposes to sell his product. But there have been these areas of progress, like the rise of women wrestlers away from the divas concept. Does he get credit for any of that, or is that other people behind the scenes trying to push this person into the 20th century?
It's always hard to say. Vince, when he was in control, always had the last word on on virtually all creative decisions. But when it comes to the progress, I think a lot of that is other people. And what you have to remember is that, yes, it is good that there is more equality, or at least something getting closer to equality among genders in wrestling, at least between cis men and cis women.
Mm-hmm.
But women's wrestling was on the path to becoming as huge in the United States as it was in Japan, where pro wrestling is very big and taken seriously, in the mid 1980s. I mean, you had Wendy Richter, this massively popular female wrestler for Vince's company, the World Wrestling Federation, who Vince executed what is known as, I hate to use a vulgar term, but it's the term of art, a screw job on Wendy Richter. Wendy Richter was getting a bit too big for her britches, and Vince McMahon, according to Wendy, flipped the script on her and made her lose a match she was supposed to win, and she walked out of the company. And that kind of thing, that kind of expression of power over women and things of that nature, I think are more defining of Vince, and really very likely, although you can't do alternate histories, held back women's wrestling decades before this recent resurgence.
Totally agree with you about that. And for people who don't remember Wendy Richter, the Rock and Wrestling connection.
Yes, she worked with Cyndi Lauper as her manager. Captain Lou Albano was her opponent and then her partner. It was a wild time for wrestling, and it was very consequential. Wendy Richter was instrumental in that, and she was basically just tossed aside. And a woman named the Fabulous Moolah, that was her in-ring name, Lillian Ellison, was more or less in charge of women's wrestling in the country and then in the WWF for a long time. And she had allegations of being a sex trafficker as well. That's a whole separate story. But wrestling has a lot of exploitation and pain on its underbelly, and it's not always acknowledged because the product seems so fun.
Yeah, how are they able to get away with this when, say, any other entertainment entity, if they attempted to, of course, we do know about Me Too in Hollywood. There are horrible things that happen in the background of pro sports, but it seems to run so coarsely through the DNA of pro wrestling, through Vince McMahon. Do you think they're able to get away with things that other cultural institutions aren't able to get away with behind the scenes?
Absolutely. I mean, you see a lot of cultural institutions these days, essentially, whether they know it or not, pulling from the playbook of Vince McMahon and wrestling. Now, the thing is, there's this concept within wrestling, kayfabe, Kayfabe. It used to just refer to the fiction that wrestling was a legitimate sport and that the characters you were seeing were how these people actually were. Well, that went away when Vince sought deregulation and in official testimony said that wrestling was fake. So in 1989, there's this big public acknowledgement that wrestling is fake, but he managed to persist by really bending reality at a level that has allowed him to get away with a lot of things. He sort of, I don't want to say invented, but certainly codified this concept that I gave the name neo kayfabe, where you intentionally, very deliberately muddy the waters of fact and fiction. You make it so that you're not saying, hey, everything you're seeing here tonight is real. You're saying, hey, everything you see tonight is fake. But wouldn't it be interesting if some of it was actually real? Why don't you do the math? And then all of a sudden, people can just make up whatever they want about reality. And more importantly, if the company gets into trouble, everything's so confusing as to what's real, what's fake, what kinds of lascivious acts Vince McMahon may have done on television versus ones he did behind the scenes, allegedly. All of these things get so confusing that people tend to just stop investigating, or they become such obsessive investigators that they sound nuts and nobody pays attention to them. You may notice some parallels to politics right here. And
everyone watching this interview is thinking about Donald Trump as you are saying what you are saying.
And Donald Trump has been watching Vince McMahon's product for decades and was watching Vince McMahon's father and grandfather's product as far back as the 1950s. Trump is a huge wrestling fan and has participated in a lot of Vince's wrestling, and I think learned a lot from him. And one of the big lessons is if you say things that are so outrageous or outrageously false or outrageously true, and you mix them in with each other to the point where no one knows what's true or false, then you can get away with a lot. You can get away with a lot. And wrestling, even before neo-kayfabe, had that kayfabe code of basically omerta. I mean, it was like a mafia. You had a lot of guys in wrestling who just did not tell the world about what happened inside wrestling. And that can be very powerful for an ecosystem.
Is this why everything you just said, why you called your book Vince McMahon and the Unmaking of America? And perhaps you could delve into that a little bit more of what that means, the unmaking of America.
Sure. I think there's a degree to which we had a social fabric that was held together by certain, let's just call them falsehoods, or you could even call them lies. And in wrestling, you had the big lie, which was everything you're seeing tonight in this show is fake. In American politics, you had the lie, this is a perfectly representative democracy. Now, it never was actually a perfectly representative democracy, but for a long time, you had a lot of people at least buying into the ideal that it should be one. And what you've seen recently, and I think Vince McMahon did this very cannily in wrestling, but you see this more broadly now. You see the social fabric getting torn because you have a broad understanding that these things are fake. Now, was it good to be held together by a lie? I'm not sure it was, but you can demonstrate that the lie was something that unified people, and this mix of fact and fiction that is deliberately muddy and confusing, it just drives people against each other. And I really think a big factor in the mess that this country is in right now is this neo-kayfabe approach to politics, business, culture, whatever. You can just throw a bunch of nonsense along with a bunch of totally true things at people, and they'll spend so much time trying to figure out what's real and what isn't that they're paying attention to you, and then you win, even if you didn't actually do anything for society. So I hope that wasn't too long an answer.
No,
that's the
a great
general
answer.
thing I'm looking at.
Yeah, and that's such a good answer. I've got a follow-up to it.
Please.
And instead of moving to the repercussions for Vince McMahon, which we have to talk about, but
we will talk about that. Yes.
But what you're saying is so important, though, that this question of belief. Do you think that because so much of what had unified this country was this idea of a truth that people also suspected was a lie, or a lie in which contained elements of truth?
Yes.
Do you think that's one of the points of attraction of pro wrestling to the, not just the American public, but internationally? This idea that, okay, at least, this is on the level fake?
Yes. I think there is a degree to which if you think that you can see through the veil of wrestling, which is harder than you'd think it would be, if you can see fully through the veil, or at least think you can, it can be very gratifying to watch something that is as often nihilistic as wrestling, because you feel like, well, at least it's honest in its dishonesty. But the trouble with that is maybe there was a time when that was true, but in the era of neo-kayfabe, you have a lot of things that are presented by the wrestling press or by WWE's documentary team or whatever as being behind the scenes truths that supersede the in-ring truths. And those behind the scenes truths are very often just as fictional, just as concocted by the people Vince McMahon has hired. And you can really get into problems when you let that appeal of going, ooh, I'm learning the truth, lead you to being deceived, which is easier than people like to think it might be.
So What repercussions are we going to see in terms of the life and professional future of the, of course, already elderly Vince McMahon, although he certainly doesn't seem to want to take a step back from the spotlight at all. But is this at long last the end of the boss, either as a character or as a person behind the scenes?
I think as a character on WWE, the odds are very much against us ever seeing Mr. McMahon again. In fact, the big question, I think, is where will we see Mr. McMahon from the past? Because here's the thing. What people may not know is WWE, although it was a family-owned, then publicly traded company that was controlled by the McMahons for decades, last year, Vince maneuvered it to a sale to Endeavor Holdings, Ari Emanuel's company, and WWE was merged with UFC to form a company called TKO. And the trouble is, Vince, in pursuing being a respectable businessman like that, ended up giving himself a boss. And I think the situation TKO and WWE find themselves in right now is they can't really afford to embrace Vince McMahon on any level because these allegations are not just about Vince. They are about complicity from the entirety of the company, or at least many people up top at the company, allegedly. And I really think when you look at the response that WWE had to the allegations and then resignation, it was very limp and confusing. You had Triple H, Paul Levesque, Vince McMahon's son-in-law, and the chief creative officer for WWE, a C-suite executive, coming out after last weekend's Royal Rumble, wrestling event, and reading a prepared statement that had nothing to do with Vince and was just about the Rumble, then got a question or two about Vince, and his response, most infamously, a reporter, Brandon Thurston, asked him, "Have you read the lawsuit?" And Triple H just said, "I have not." And I don't think at this point that the corporate bean counters who own this wrestling product are going to have the same kind of loyalty to Vince McMahon or the wrestling business that the old hand-picked Vince McMahon crew from when it was an independent company would have had. So I think, to answer your question, I don't know what Vince McMahon's future looks like exactly, but it's going to be wrapped up in these allegations for a while. Barring Trump winning again and just squashing the federal investigation into Vince, there is this federal probe going on that the authority, there was just a report this morning from the Wall Street Journal that this probe is incorporating these sex trafficking allegations, and that case will eventually come to something. Presumably, again, anything can happen, but if it comes to fruition, that'll be a whole new low for Vince. That'll be a really difficult situation. I think his legacy is really challenged, but there's a lot still to be seen as to how this plays out.
Now, I saw that Triple H, aka Paul Levesque, press conference. It totally looked like a hostage video.
Yeah.
He looked miserable, and frankly, he looked old, which I've never said about Triple H before.
It's been a rough year for Paul Levesque. Whatever you think about his response, I cannot imagine the turbulence of going through this year at WWE.
Yeah. But does his performance at that, I guess you just answered it, but I wanted to ask you if his performance reflected anything about what's going on. Maybe you could speak about that.
Yes, I think it
for him.
reflected, if anything, if nothing else, I should say, it reflected the confusion in wrestling right now as to what the party line is. Because the party line for 40 years, if you work for Vince, or if you hope to work for Vince someday, or you fear you might have to, the party line has always been, don't rat out Vince. Don't say anything bad about Vince. Don't say anything Vince wouldn't want you to say. And now we're in this completely unprecedented situation where Vince is still alive, but not somebody that is protected in the way that he was. And he's no longer anybody's boss there. So what I think Paul Levesque's statement reflected was this total unwillingness to be the first person to stick your neck out, which is just how wrestling works. It's a very vicious ecosystem, and nobody wants to be the one who takes the risk of ticking off Vince McMahon. That said, now you're like, well, maybe I should be speaking out. If you're an executive, I should speak out because That would be me being loyal to TKO and to Ari Emanuel. But Ari Emanuel and TKO have not made a party line publicly clear. If something has gone on internally, no one's heard about it. So I think there's just a lot of confusion. And Triple H's response really reflected the fact that nobody knows what to say.
Look, I am not a pessimist by nature, but I actually can see a world where Trump wins re-election, squashes the federal probe, and Vince actually comes out to the ring triumphant as the guy who won, and a section of the fan base celebrates the fact that Vince is able to get away with it and beat back the government and
beat Biden's Justice Department. Yeah, there is a non-zero chance that if Trump wins, this investigation gets crushed. But if Trump wins, there's a whole other set of problems that are going to create multi-ball situation in the pinball machine. So I can't really predict.
Yeah, it's just more the nature of the wrestling fan, which of course is heterogeneous. I can see.
Absolutely. But there are a lot of people in wrestling fandom who are very MAGA, who don't trust Biden's Justice Department. And there's plenty of people out there you can find in the internet wrestling community right now howling that this is a witch hunt, et cetera, et cetera. So, yeah, you have a section of wrestling fandom that's pretty much diehard pro Vince and does not really tolerate much evidence in the other direction. My Amazon and Goodreads reviews will be a perfect testament to this.
Can't wait for that. You've been so generous with your time, but I'm not quite ready to let you go. Can I ask you just another question?
Please hit me.
If that's okay.
I'm ready.
All right. So the Slim Jim situation, where Slim Jim, the longtime sponsor of WWE, pulls its sponsorship after the allegations drop, and then within 24 hours brings it right back in. There was the Netflix deal that was announced just days before these allegations dropped. $multi-million deal for Netflix to host a ton of WWE
multi-billion
content.
It was $5 billion.
That's right. Billion. That's right. Here's the question. Is any of that threatened right now, or are the trains just going to keep running on time? Monday Night Raw and the rest of it.
If Vince were still involved with the company right now, I would say that some of those partnerships might be in danger. But he resigned, and the company has, although they don't really have much of a narrative about what's going on, they have cut ties with him, at least publicly. So I think, as far as corporate damage control goes, I think the brand has not endured that much damage yet. Now, I say yet because it's unclear who's going to get implicated as these lawsuits and the federal probe continue. I mean, already in the lawsuit, you had unnamed people who were identified by their titles, WWE Corporate Officer number 2, WWE Superstar number 1, and if these people get fully outed, and if more people are found, it's unclear exactly what the response will be. But I would say that my prediction is WWE will probably be fine. It's been the brand has been through horrible scandal in the past, and it's generally come out just fine. It's not as popular as it was at the turn of the millennium, but it's a very solid media empire. So I don't think WWE is that much threatened, but Vince McMahon is no longer with WWE, and he definitely faces some real threats.
Wow. Last question. People like myself who love the art of wrestling can't stand Vince McMahon, and to a large degree can't stand WWE. Is there still a place for us in this sport?
Well, I mean, obviously there's AEW, which is the much smaller rival run by Tony Khan. But I would tell people to go out to wherever you are in the United States. I guarantee you there is an independent wrestling promotion somewhere near you, comprised of day players who all have real jobs, or at least are seeking real jobs in this economy, and are not egomaniacal megastars. They're people who are really in it for the love of it, because there ain't no money in it. And if you are interested in wrestling, and I love the art form so deeply, I always tell people, go see your local independent wrestling promotion. Don't necessarily spend the money on going to a big corporate thing. You can have the real experience in a VFW hall with a bunch of sweaty accountants wrestling each other. It's really kind of a magical experience.
Amen to that. Abraham, Josephine Riesman, you're a terrific interview. The subject is so
Thank you.
important. The book is Ringmaster, Vince McMahon, and the Unmaking of America. Thank you so much for joining us here on Edge of Sports.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you so much for watching the Real News Network, where we lift up the voices, stories, and struggles that you care about most. And we need your help to keep doing this work. So please, tap your screen now, subscribe, and donate to the Real News Network. Solidarity forever.